I wanted to share some things that I think about when I want to explore phrasing and to kind of understand what the composer was trying to do so that my music reflects that. I was talking recently to someone I'd met through a musical online masterclass setting. We were both in the audience listening to someone give a masterclass online, and there was this question and answer session where I ended up starting to privately message one of the other participants because they had posed a question about musicality and phrasing and how to approach phrasing in a way where we understand what to do with a phrase, how to go about figuring out what we might want to do so that not all our phrases sound the same. And I wanted to share some of the thoughts that I had for this person in particular. So I always like to go from bigger picture to smaller picture and to look at the general structure of the piece, to look at my climaxes, which are my biggest points of intensity. And I think generally the music is going to be kind of ramping up to those points and then coming down afterwards from those points. And it's important to shape our phrases and our sounds in ways that reflect that kind of increasing or decreasing intensity. And that might be shown through the intensity of vibrato that we use, how much bow we use, where our contact point on the string is, whether it's closer to the bridge or farther to the fingerboard. All of those things are elements that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about how to physically make the colors or the sounds that we're imagining for particular sections or phrases. And so, going back to this idea of bigger to smaller picture, I think too often people think about phrasing and they go immediately to individual phrases, notes even, and think, how am I going to make each note different from the other? And I think that can be a stumbling point because it takes away the idea of context. I think every note has a context, it has a relationship to the notes around it, and nothing can be kind of looked at in a vacuum. And so we need to know what's happening in our structure of our piece. We need to know where we are going to in terms of the direction of our phrasing so that we can then make a decision on maybe what that individual note or part of the phrase is going to sound like. And so that's why I like to go from bigger to smaller picture. We get to have that bigger context in mind, things start to make sense. When we go from the bigger to the smaller picture, we're able to pick apart things that come back later. So if I look at a whole movement or a whole piece generally at first and kind of get an idea for what the main motives or the main thematic material is, I might understand that something from the beginning might come back in the recapitulation. Or, for example, I think in the Walton Viola Concerto, a main melody in the opening of the first movement comes back at the end of the third movement. It's this idea of the composer coming full circle, and if I didn't know that, I wouldn't know that I should reminisce to the beginning of the piece. I wouldn't understand maybe the element of nostalgia that I might put in my tone, and so the mood is going to be completely different if I don't know that. And where it says to be softer and that it's at the end of the piece, you can have so many different soft dynamics. You could have a loving soft tone, you could have a whisper, you could have something that's dying away. And all of those could be very different feelings than nostalgia or harking back to the past and feeling a longing for that. And that's kind of the thing that I want to be thinking about at the end of that third movement. We've come all this way and we're going back to this thing that we heard even in the beginning of the piece, but whereas it was hopeful in the beginning, maybe, and yearning, now it has an element of nostalgia, of looking back. And so all of these things are things we want to think about when we are approaching phrases, because if we just look at the phrase itself, we won't know the context of it. If I just looked at the ending of that third movement of the Walton, I wouldn't know the context of it having appeared way before, I wouldn't know how to make it different. I wouldn't know how to phrase it well and how the composer really was intending it to be played at the end. So I hope all of those points and elements were helpful to think about for when you want to be score studying, when you want to be making decisions for phrasing, so that you can be making music that not only is evocative, but also makes sense and is what the composer wanted.